Hi guys, and welcome here to Distilling, where today we're looking at our grain mill. Now, these little grain mills we stock for people that want to mill their own grain at home. And the reason you would want to do that is to play around with what grit size or milling size of the grain works best for the whiskey that you want to make, or the starch conversion that you want to do, whether that's for whiskey, vodka, bourbon, or whatever the case may be. Now, those of you that's already done training with us, specifically the W2 grain-based spirits course, you would know the impact and the massive impact that grit size has on yield specifically, but also on flavor profile. And depending on what you're making, you'll want to play around with different grit sizes to see what gives you the best extraction, both in terms of yield and flavor, and what works best for the equipment that you're using. Because sometimes if you mill too small, yes, it gives you the highest yield, but it's difficult to separate. Other way around, if it's too big, you don't get enough extraction. It's easy to separate, but you don't get enough extraction, you don't get enough flavor. So you might want to play around with that. Now, this grain mill allows you to do that. And the reason why it's so nice is that you have an adjustable roller spacing. Here at the bottom, you can see these two rollers, tungsten rollers that can handle it, that can handle a lot of punishment. And this spacing of these two rollers are adjustable. Now, we do that by loosening the nut on either side, and when we loosen this nut, we can then adjust this spacing by turning these little knobs. Now, you have to adjust both rollers to make sure that you get the proper adjustment. Now, it is graduated, so you can adjust the same way every single time, and that allows you to get consistency during your adjustment, to make sure that every time you mill the grain, it's milled the same way. So you loosen the nuts, you make the adjustment on either side, and you tighten the nut again. You then mount this on top of a base, which can just be a wooden plank with a hole cut in it, and you just turn it by hand. Alternatively, you can remove this handle and you can mount it on a drill, and you can power it by a drill. However, that's not always recommended because it can force grain through, which is not really a problem with the grain, but it does become a problem when you use this for its alternative use, which is grinding botanicals. Now, the grinding of botanicals is for, obviously, when we make gin. If you want to infuse gin, then we can use this to grind the botanicals. And I'll be honest with you, we actually sell more of these for gin producers or people playing around with gin than we do with guys that use it for grain, because they normally have a grit size that they buy in from us or from another supplier already, and they're happy with that. So most of these grain mills are actually being used by people doing gin product development. Now, the reason why these are used to grind the botanicals for gin, firstly, by exposing more surface area on a botanical, you actually get more flavor out because there's more surface area exposed. So that's the one reason why we grind it. But the other reason why we use this, instead of the more traditional and romantic mortar and pestle method, is when you use a mortar and pestle, you have a consistency problem. Because today I'm using a mortar and pestle and I get really, really fine because I'm all energetic and I had a good night's rest. But tomorrow I'm tired, and now I'm not grinding it as fine as I did yesterday. So I become the variable in the consistency of my gin. Because if those botanicals are not crushed the same way every single time, your gin is not going to taste the same way every single time. By working with this roller spacing, which is fixed and is a fixed measurement, I can consistently crush my botanicals the same way every single time. I don't have that variance in flavor profile. The other benefit to use this with a hand crank when crushing botanicals, and this is why I say not necessarily a good idea to put this onto a drill, is when you do it by hand, if something gets stuck in here while I'm turning it, something gets stuck, I reverse and I go forward again. I don't try to force it through. Where when I'm using a drill or a powered grinder or a coffee grinder or anything like that, if I use an electric motor to drive the milling process, it will force the botanical through. Now that generates heat. That friction generates heat, which negatively impacts on the flavor profile of the Botanical. My flavor is going to change. It's not going to taste the same as I want it to taste. So with a manual grinder, I can just reverse. I don't cause friction. I don't affect the flavor profile of the Botanical that I'm using. So that's our grain mill or Botanical mill if you want to play with chip.